At Kensington Dynamics' year-end party, Marcus Whitmore arrived in a battered 1970 Dodge Charger and became the joke of the night. Sabrina Cole called the single data failure in front of everyone and told him to use the service entrance next time. Marcus said nothing. Minutes later, a red Ferrari stopped outside the hotel. Executive Renata Voss stepped out, walked straight past the managers, and in front of the crowd handed him a folder and said, "Mr. Whitmore, the board is waiting on your signature." Why did a room that had laughed at him suddenly go pale? The operations floor at Kensington Dynamics ran on gray carpet, gray partitions, and the sound of printers nobody had replaced in 6 years. It sat 2 levels below the executive suites in a tower on the west side of Denver, and most of the people who worked there measured their careers in badge photos that got older while the badge number stayed the same. Marcus Whitmore had one of those desks. He had one of those badge photos. Nothing about the space suggested he had ever asked for anything more. He was 39, and he wore the same 3 or 4 button-down shirts in rotation. None of them expensive. All of them pressed. He got his own coffee from the machine on the east wall instead of sending an assistant, because he did not have an assistant. He filed his own reports. He answered his own phone. When the building's heating failed in November and half the floor worked in coats for 2 days, he worked in a coat for 2 days and did not complain about it in the group chat like everyone else. People noticed him the way you notice furniture that has always been in the room. What they remembered, when they remembered anything, was how calm he was. Not cheerful, not warm, exactly calm, without effort, as if the temperature of a room simply did not reach him. That calm got tested more often than it should have. When a project manager named Victor Lang presented a cost reduction model in a quarterly review and never mentioned that Marcus had built the entire framework for it, Marcus sat in the third row and clapped with everyone else. Afterward, in the hallway, Victor waited for the confrontation with his shoulders already braced. Marcus told him the numbers on slide 7 were off by a rounding error, and walked to the elevator. When somebody made a joke at his expense, he let it land and die. When Sabrina Reed said in front of the whole department that he had no ambition, that some people were simply built to hold a chair down, he did not argue. He did not go quiet in the wounded way people go quiet. He kept working, and by the end of the week nobody could remember whether he had responded at all. That was the part people misread. Silence in an office is a language, and everyone assumed they were fluent in it. A man who does not fight back cannot fight back. A man who does not defend himself has nothing worth defending. The floor arrived at that conclusion slowly and comfortably, the way you arrive at any conclusion that costs you nothing. Sabrina Cole arrived at it faster than anyone, and she enjoyed it more. She was 31 and had come into Kensington Dynamics 3 years earlier with a plan she talked about openly, which was rare in a place where most people hid their plans. She wanted a director's title before she was 35. She dressed for the job above the one she had. She learned the names of every executive assistant on the 22nd floor before she learned the names of the people who sat 10 feet from her. She was good at her work, genuinely good, and she had decided somewhere along the line that being good at her work entitled her to say whatever she wanted about people who were not. Marcus became her favorite subject. She never seemed to plan it, it simply happened whenever he was in range. She would ask, loud enough for the row behind her, why a man closing in on 40 still dressed like a summer hire. She would tell the break room that Marcus probably spent a full month's salary keeping that ancient Charger running, and that there was something almost noble about a man pouring everything he had into a machine that would never be worth anything. She said it with a smile that made it sound like affection, which is what made it work. Her best line, the one she reused because it always got a laugh, was delivered with a coffee cup in her hand, her eyes never quite reaching him. Some people work their entire lives, she liked to say, and still end up standing exactly where they started. Marcus heard it. He heard all of it. There was a small motion he made when it happened, a slight settling of his shoulders. And then he went back to whatever was on his screen. In all the time she had known him, no one on that floor had ever seen him raise his voice. Nobody could explain why he never reacted. A few people decided he was beaten down. A few decided he was slow. A woman in accounts payable named Naomi Price decided he was the only person on that floor who had never once made her feel small. She had been passed over for a senior analyst seat twice in 2 years, both times without being told why, and she had said what she thought of Marcus exactly once, to no effect at all. Nobody asked the more interesting question, which was what a man has to know about his own position before other people's opinions of it stop mattering. Nothing in Marcus Whitmore's file suggested there was anything to know. He was listed as operations. He was a single father who lived on the north side. He drove a car older than most of the building, and he had driven it since long before any of them met him, which meant it was the one thing in his life he had never traded upward. That was all anyone had, and nobody went looking for more. The announcement went out on the first Monday of December, and it went out from Gordon Pierce's office, which told everyone it mattered. Kensington Dynamics would hold its year-end celebration at the Ashford Hotel, downtown, ballroom level, black tie, the largest event the company had staged in 9 years. There would be a full bar, a string quartet, and valet service at the north entrance. Attendance for the operations and strategy divisions was described as strongly encouraged, which in that building meant mandatory. The second paragraph was the one people read twice. Leadership would use the evening to outline the coming restructuring and to announce several new management appointments. The floor changed within an hour. People who had spent the year avoiding each other started scheduling coffee. 2 men from strategy began sending calendar invites to executives who had never answered them before. The restructure had been rumored since August. All of it had been abstract, and now it had a date and a dress code. Sabrina Cole treated the announcement like a starting gun. She had been told twice, by people close enough to Gordon Pierce to be worth believing, that the restructuring would create a director's seat over the combined operations and delivery groups. She had run the numbers on her own performance and found them excellent. She had a dress selected within 36 hours. Black, cut sharp at the shoulder, from a designer she made sure to mention by name at least once a day for the following week. She arranged a car too, a leased sedan she referred to in conversation as her car, and she began a campaign of small, visible conversations with senior people in hallways and elevators. None of it was subtle. Subtlety was not the point. The point was that by the night of the party, everyone who mattered would already associate her face with the word director. She talked about the evening constantly, and because she talked about it constantly, she eventually talked about who else was going. She found out Marcus was attending on a Thursday afternoon from the sign-in sheet, and she looked at it for a moment before she turned around with the expression of someone who had just been handed a gift. "You're going," she said to him, holding the sheet up so the desks around them could see it. Marcus kept typing. "I am." She leaned against the partition beside his monitor. There were 4 or 5 people within easy hearing distance, and she waited for them to look up before she continued, because a line delivered to one person is only a comment. "Then do yourself a favor," she said. "Rent something decent for the night. There will be board members at that hotel. Don't pull that rolling museum of yours up in front of leadership." A man 2 desks over laughed into his hand. Someone else looked at the ceiling. Marcus stopped typing then and turned in his chair to face her fully, which he almost never did. Whatever people were expecting, it did not arrive. "I like my car," he said. Sabrina laughed a real laugh, unguarded and delighted, the laugh of a person who has just confirmed something she already believed. She told him that was exactly the problem, said it kindly, and walked back to her desk, still smiling. Marcus turned back to his screen. Across the aisle, Naomi Price watched the whole thing and said nothing, because saying something had not worked the first time. The Ashford Hotel had a portico wide enough for 3 vehicles and a doorman who had worked there 19 years and had stopped being impressed by anything sometime around the 2nd year. By 7:40, the line of arrivals had settled into a rhythm. A silver Mercedes, a Porsche in a green so dark it read black under the lights, 2 Bentleys within 4 minutes of each other, which caused a small delay while the valet team sorted out who was blocking whom. Guests stepped out under the heat lamps, and the ballroom filled with the specific sound of 200 people who all wanted to be seen arriving. Sabrina arrived at 7:50. She had timed it deliberately. Late enough that the room was full, early enough that leadership had not yet retreated into their private circles. She spent the first 20 minutes moving through the floor like a woman working a room she already owned. At 8:05, the Charger came up the block and turned into the portico. It was a 1970 Dodge Charger, dark green, with a hood that had been repainted at least once and a driver's side mirror that did not quite match the body. The engine was loud the way old engines are loud, not aggressive, just present, and it filled the space under the portico roof for a full 4 seconds before it shut off. 2 women in the entry line turned around. The doorman looked up from his podium. Inside the lobby near the glass, Sabrina saw it and set her drink down. She did not simply watch. She turned and gathered people, 2 women from strategy and a man from finance, and pointed through the window with the enthusiasm of someone showing friends a comet. Marcus got out. He wore a dark suit, well cut and plain. No pocket square, no watch anyone could see. He closed the door with the particular care of a man who knew the door needed care. "That is the car," Sabrina said, her voice carrying out through the entry doors, which were open for the arrivals. "That is genuinely the car. I want you to understand that my dress cost more than that vehicle. I am not exaggerating for effect. My dress." The man from finance laughed. One of the women from strategy laughed, then looked slightly uncomfortable about it, then laughed again because the first laugh had already committed her. The valet came around the front of the Charger. He was young, maybe 23, and had spent the last hour parking German sedans. He looked at the car, then at the man standing beside it, and made the calculation people in his position make 40 times a night. "Sir, service and vendor access is around the side," he said, pointing east. "Loading entrance takes you straight to the kitchen level." Marcus did not correct him immediately. He looked toward where the young man was pointing, as though genuinely considering the route. Sabrina was already moving. She came out through the doors into the cold, holding the hem of her dress off the pavement, and stopped 6 feet from him, her face lit up. "You heard the man, Marcus." She said it loudly, and there were now perhaps 15 people in earshot, some of them Kensington employees and some of them not. "Service entrance. Somebody in this city finally knows where you belong." The laughter that followed was not universal and it was not comfortable. A few people laughed. More of them looked away and pretended to check their phones, which is its own kind of participation. The valet realized something had gone wrong and his face changed. He started to apologize. Marcus stopped him with a small shake of the head. "You didn't do anything," he told him. Then he stood there for a moment in the cold under the heat lamps, his hands still resting on the roof of the Charger. There were 2 ways out of that moment and both of them were open. He could get back in. The keys were in his hand, the engine was still warm, and nobody in that lobby would have been surprised. By Monday, the story would have been that he could not take a joke. That version had a certain comfort to it. He would not have to walk into a room where the temperature had already been set against him. Or he could go in. He looked at Sabrina for a few seconds. It was not a glare. There was no heat in it at all, and that was the strange part. The part the woman from strategy would think about later without being able to say why. He looked at her the way a man looks at a document he intends to read all the way through. Then he turned and handed the keys to the valet. "It sticks in second when it's cold," Marcus said. "Don't force it. It'll go." The young man took the keys carefully. "Yes, sir." Marcus buttoned his jacket and walked past Sabrina, past the doorman, through the glass, and into the ballroom of the Ashford Hotel, where 200 people from Kensington Dynamics were drinking champagne and waiting to find out who was going up and who was going away. Behind him, the Charger turned over on the first try and rolled down the ramp into the garage. The ballroom of the Ashford was warm and gold-lit, with round tables along the walls and a cleared floor in the center where the string quartet played under a ceiling of hanging glass. 200 people from Kensington Dynamics moved through it in a slow current, and the current had a direction toward the corner where the executives had gathered. Marcus took a glass of water from a passing tray and stood near the eastern columns, close enough to the room to be part of it and far enough back to see all of it at once. He spent a few minutes with a logistics supervisor named Harold Stein, talking about a warehouse lease that was up for renewal in March. He nodded at Naomi Price, who had come alone and looked like she wanted to leave already. He did not move toward the executives. Sabrina did. She had recovered from the cold of the portico and re-entered the room with the story already forming. Within 20 minutes, half the ballroom knew that Marcus Whitmore had arrived in a car older than most of the guests and had been mistaken for a vendor. The story would have died on its own. She did not let it. She found him near the columns just before 9, with a group of 3 managers. She had been circling all evening, and she brought them over like a host presenting an exhibit. "You have to meet Marcus," she said. "Marcus has been in operations since before I was hired. He is proof that this company is truly, deeply loyal to its long-serving people." There was a beat while the sentence landed, and then 2 of the managers laughed. The third, a heavy-set man from procurement, smiled without committing to it. Marcus shook their hands. He asked the procurement manager a specific question about a supplier contract coming up for renewal, and the man answered it. For about 90 seconds, the conversation was an ordinary conversation between adults. Sabrina steered it back. She always did. She mentioned the charger again, then made a remark about how some people build careers and some people build hobbies, and the group broke apart shortly afterward with the vague discomfort of people who had enjoyed something they would not have wanted recorded. Gordon Pierce watched the entire exchange from 12 feet away. He was 54, silver at the temples, and had run the operations and strategy divisions for 6 years on a philosophy he stated openly at every town hall, that Kensington dynamics rewarded performance and nothing else. He had a glass of scotch in his hand and a clear view of Sabrina working the group. He did not intervene. He did not frown. When Sabrina caught his eye afterward, he lifted his glass an inch, and she read that gesture correctly, because it was meant to be read. Later, near the bar, she said something that carried further than she intended. She was talking to the 2 women from strategy about the guest list, and she said that events like this one were really for people who were moving upward, and that it was a little sad the company invited everyone, because it forced certain people to spend a night pretending they belonged in the room. Gordon was 4 feet away. He heard it. He smiled into his drink and turned back to his conversation. Marcus, standing by the columns with the same untouched glass of water, heard it too. He did not react, and by now the absence of reaction had stopped reading as restraint to anyone watching. It read as confirmation. Sabrina had spent 3 years telling a room that this man had nothing in him, and the room had spent an entire evening watching him prove it by standing very still. So she went further, because there was nothing to stop her. She started making comparisons out loud. A man from strategy who had joined 2 years after Marcus and now ran a team of 14, a woman who had transferred out of operations and was in the Seattle office with a title. She built a small architecture of examples, and the charger sat at the bottom of it as the illustration. "That car isn't a car," she told a group near the dessert table, loudly enough that the columns could hear it. "It's a resume. It's the resume of a failure. And he parks it out front like he's proud of it." At 9:40, the quartet stopped, and Gordon Pierce walked up onto the low stage at the north end of the ballroom. He spoke for 11 minutes. He thanked people. He named 3 divisions that had beaten their targets and did not name operations, which several people noticed. Then he came to the part everyone had been waiting for, and his voice dropped into the register of a man who wants a sentence remembered. Kensington, he said, was entering a new phase. The restructuring would be finalized within the week. The company was going to become faster, leaner, and more demanding, and he wanted to be honest with everyone in the room about what that meant. There would be people who could adapt to that, and there would be people who could not, and the ones who could not were going to be left behind. He said it was not a threat. He said it was a courtesy. The applause was solid and slightly nervous. On the floor, Sabrina found Marcus across the room and smiled at him, holding it long enough to be certain he had seen it. Go to sir365@hut.com. Chairman Whitmore, everything is ready. The word did not land all at once. It moved outward in rings. The people nearest the columns heard it clean and stopped breathing. The people at the tables heard it a half-second later and turned to their neighbors to confirm it. By the time it reached the bar at the far end, it had been repeated 4 times, and nobody was repeating it as a question anymore.
Naomi Price sat down in the nearest chair without checking whether it was occupied. Sabrina Cole did not move at all. Her hand was still slightly forward from where the glass had been taken out of it. She was looking at Marcus, and her face was trying to reassemble 3 years of certainty in under 10 seconds, and could not find a starting point. Marcus closed the folder. He was not a man who had just come into money, and that was the part the room got wrong first, because it was the easier explanation. Half of them spent those 10 seconds assuming there had been an inheritance, a buyout, a lottery of some kind that had happened this week. There had been nothing this week. There had been nothing this year. Marcus Whitmore had been the chairman of Kensington Dynamics the entire time. He had been the chairman when Sabrina told the breakroom he spent a month's salary keeping his car alive. He had been the chairman when Victor Lang presented his framework and left his name off it. He had been the chairman when the heating failed in November and he worked in a coat for 2 days at a desk 2 floors below his own boardroom. The company had started as a small industrial supplier on the south edge of the city, and Marcus had come into it at 25 on the operating side and had spent 8 years acquiring position in it a piece at a time, while it grew into something with 900 employees and a tower on the west side. He had done the acquiring through a holding company that carried a different name, because that was how the lawyers had structured it, and because he had never seen a reason to change it once the growth stopped being fragile, 6 years ago. He stepped out of the public part of the job entirely. He stopped appearing in the annual report photographs. He stopped taking interviews. He put the executive team in front of the daily business and let them run it, and he ran the things only a chairman runs, for 900 employees. The chairman of Kensington Dynamics was a scanned signature at the bottom of a governance letter and a name on a filing that nobody outside legal had ever opened. Gordon Pierce had run 2 divisions for 6 years without once being in a room with the man. 4 people in the building knew the face. Renata Voss was one of them. The rest depended on something simpler and more reliable than any security protocol, that nobody in an office ever looks twice at a middle-aged man in a plain shirt getting his own coffee. What had brought him downstairs was paper. Internal reports out of 2 divisions had started coming in wrong, in a way that did not show on a balance sheet. Exit interviews with the same language repeating across unrelated departments. A retention number in operations that had gotten quietly ugly. Complaints closed as resolved without anyone being able to say what had been resolved. Marcus could have read those reports for another decade and learned nothing beyond what he already knew, that something was rotting, and the people responsible for describing it were the people it protected. So he went down and sat in it. He had kept a desk on that floor on and off for years. A week here, a month there, whenever he wanted to see the operating side without a presentation between him and it. For the last several months, he had worked it every single day, and that was long enough for the floor to stop seeing him as anything but part of the furniture. For those months, he had watched, without interference, exactly how the people of Kensington Dynamics treated a man they believed had no power at all. His silence had never been weakness. It had been the instrument. Renata took the signed folder back and closed the case over it. Then she said the last piece out loud, because the room needed it, and because Marcus had asked her to. The document was the restructuring plan, not a draft, not a recommendation. The version that took effect Monday morning. Every section of it had been complete for 11 days, except one, the section covering leadership appointments and management accountability. That section had been left blank at the chairman's instruction, pending his own assessment of the operations group. He had filled it in and signed it at 11 o'clock at night, in a ballroom, in front of everyone it applied to. Sabrina came out of it then. Some instinct older than her judgment took over, and she moved toward him with her hands slightly open. "Marcus." Her voice had gone light and fast. "Marcus, I want to say the car, the things tonight, that was a joke." That's how we talk on the floor. You know that. You've always known that. You never once said anything, so I assumed everybody assumed. She ran out of sentence. Marcus showed no anger at all, and that was what made it worse for the people standing closest. There was nothing in his face for anyone to push against. "If I really were just an employee in operations," he asked her, "would anything you said tonight have been more true?" Sabrina did not answer,
because there was no answer that helped her.
Saying no meant admitting all 3 years.
Saying yes meant saying it again to the chairman's face in front of 200 people. Marcus waited a reasonable amount of time, and when nothing came, he moved on. He did not remove her over a joke about a car, and he said so plainly, to her and to the room, because he wanted that part understood before anything else. A car was a car. If the evening had been about a car, he would have gone home and forgotten it by Tuesday. What he laid out instead was what he had collected over months of sitting 10 feet from her. There was a pattern in how she treated people by rank, consistent enough to function as a policy. Junior staff got a version of Sabrina Cole that nobody above her ever saw. Julian Ross had gotten it half an hour earlier, over a spilled glass, in front of 40 witnesses, and Julian was only the most recent name on a list with 9 other names on it. There was the matter of credit. Work that came up through her group and reached leadership arrived with her name attached to the parts that had gone well and other people's names attached to the parts that had not. Marcus named 2 specific projects. He named the months. He did not raise his voice for any of it. And there was the standard she applied to competence, which she had stated herself, in front of witnesses, 90 minutes earlier, with a glass in her hand at the center of 25 employees, clothing, money, visibility. She had called it visibility and seemed to think that made it neutral. Then Marcus turned to Gordon Pierce, and the room turned with him. "You knew," he said. Gordon began to say that he had been unaware of the extent of anything, and Marcus let him finish the sentence out of some kind of courtesy, then took it apart in 4 lines. 2 of the 9 complaints had been closed by Gordon's office personally, without an interview of the person who filed them. He had stood 8 feet from the Julian Ross incident with a scotch in his hand and watched it happen. He had raised his glass an inch to Sabrina after the introduction near the columns. A small gesture that also functions as authorization. And 20 minutes earlier, in the corridor by the coat check, he had told her that people who did not fit a high-performance culture had a way of disappearing during a reorganization. Gordon asked how he could possibly know what was said in that corridor. Marcus told him there had been 4 other people standing in it, that 2 of them worked in delivery and reported to Gordon, and that a man who does not bother to lower his voice in front of subordinates has already decided those subordinates do not count. None of it had been secret. That was the point he made last, and he made it to the whole room rather than to Gordon. Nothing that had happened at Kensington Dynamics over the last several months had been hidden. It had been tolerated, because Sabrina Cole produced excellent results, and results had become the only language the leadership of that company agreed to speak. Results can put a person into a management seat, Marcus said. How they treat the people who can do nothing for them decides whether they deserve to stay in it. The director's position over operations and delivery did not go to Sabrina Cole. The seat was left unfilled, and the recommendation carrying her name never reached the board. Gordon Pierce was placed under a formal review of his management accountability, on the specific grounds that he had known about a hostile pattern on his floor and permitted it because it was profitable. The final provision was the one Marcus had gone downstairs for in the first place. Every person in operations assessed under that culture in the last 2 years would be re-evaluated on their actual work, by people who had not been in the room when the original assessments were made. Julian Ross was in that group. So was Harold Stein, who had run a warehouse portfolio for 9 years without a promotion. So was Naomi Price, who heard her division named and put her hand flat on the tablecloth to steady herself. Marcus took nothing from the people who had laughed under the portico. The 2 women from strategy kept their jobs. The man from finance kept his. The 2 managers who had laughed at the introduction near the columns kept their titles and their bonuses. Not one of them was punished for a laugh. He simply made every one of them stand in a gold-lit ballroom at 11 o'clock at night and look directly at the thing they had been laughing at. That was the entire penalty, and several of them would have preferred to be fired. The room emptied faster than a party normally empties. Renata Voss walked out with Marcus a little after 11:30, through the lobby, past the doorman, whose 19 years on that podium had just been considerably improved. The red Ferrari sat under the heat lamps where she had left it. Beside it stood the young valet, holding a set of keys, having worked out roughly 40 minutes ago whose car he had parked and what he had said to the man who owned it. He would tell that story for the rest of his life. The Charger was already up from the garage and idling rough in the cold, the mismatched mirror catching the portico lights. The two cars sat there together, and the contrast was so complete that Renata laughed at it. "Chairman Whitmore," she said, "would you like a ride home?" Marcus looked at the Ferrari for a moment. Then he looked at the Charger. He took the keys from the valet, thanked him by name, and said good night. By 7:45 the next morning, the story had run through the entire building. It went through the operations floor first, then upward. By 8 o'clock, the parking structure on the west side held more people than it had any business holding, standing near the elevators with coffee they were not drinking. What they were waiting for was the other car. The assumption was universal and unspoken. A man's identity had been made public in front of 200 people, and men do not go back afterward. They expected something German or Italian. They expected a driver. Several of them had privately decided the Charger would be quietly gone by spring. At 8:14, the same as every other day, an old engine came up the ramp. The Charger turned onto the second level and parked in the same space it had used for months, which was not reserved and was not near the doors. The engine shut off. Marcus Whitmore got out in one of the same plain button-down shirts, carrying the same bag, and locked the door by hand. There was no driver. There was nobody with him. He was not wearing anything different, and he was not walking differently. He nodded at the two people nearest the elevator. One of them managed to say good morning, and he said good morning back. Nothing about Marcus had changed. The only thing that had changed was how every person in that garage looked at him. And that was exactly what he had wanted them to notice. Do not wait until you know a person's title, their bank balance, or their power before deciding whether they deserve to be treated well. Sabrina Cole's entire manner toward Marcus Whitmore reversed itself in the 4 seconds it took to hear one word, and Marcus was the same man before that word as he was after it. The old car did not make him worth less. A Ferrari does not make anyone worth more. Nothing about him changed at 11 o'clock that night except the information available to the people watching, and information about a person is not the same thing as the truth about them. The real character of a person does not show in how they treat the people who can help them. It shows in how they treat the people they are certain can do nothing for them. And sometimes the quietest person in the room is not the weakest one there. He simply has nothing to prove.